Pluralism. Pluralism is one of the distinctive aspects of our contemporary life. We live in a world that is plural. Many religions, many races, many different worldviews and perspectives, not just around the world, but even just around the block. Increasingly, people live in close proximity to people of very different cultures, very different religions, very different races. This pluralism has an interesting impact, and it has an interesting effect on how our Christian faith is actually lived. And what we're going to do in this session is going to look a little bit about that. How do we as Christians live in the context of a plural world? How can we be faithful to God in the situations that we face where there are many competing ideas, many competing ways of living and thinking? The way that Hollinger introduces the idea is this way. He says, pluralism does not primarily refer to differing races, ethnic groups, nationalities, and cultures living side by side within given communities or societies as a whole. That is true, that it's plural, but within this matrix, something more profound occurs. There is the socio-cultural reality of discrepant worldviews, ideologies, and moral frameworks existing side by side, and this raises two apparent, and the key word there is apparent, dilemmas. The truth dilemma and the social dilemma. So this is what we're going to look at first. We're going to look at how do these dilemmas, the truth dilemma and the social dilemma, create a challenge for Christian faithfulness in the world in which we live. So what are these dilemmas? Well, the truth dilemma is the idea that the presence of many perspectives on truth leads to the prescription that all claims to truth are only points of view and nothing more. That is to say, truth is purely or only perspectival. There is no truth beyond truth to evaluate your truth claims. There's no capital T truth. There's only small t truths, many truths, your truth, my truth, their truth, our truth. So ultimately, what this does is that it suggests that any and all claims to universal truth are suspect, arrogant, and narrow-minded. Instead, all perspectives of truth should be considered equally valid. Now, it's not really our purpose here to evaluate or critique this conclusion. It's clearly self-refuting because it's claiming that all truth is perspectival except its own claim. So it's saying that truth is perspectival except for the fact that truth is perspectival. So it's self-defeating and self-destructs. But be that as it may, from a kind of general sociological reality right now, people tend to believe these claims, even though they are logically easily refuted and clearly demonstrably false. But they are the challenges that Christianity has to live within, whether they are defensible or not. The second dilemma is what we call the social dilemma. And here, the idea is that how can Christianity effectively relate to and inculcate its viewpoints through discipleship, through persuasion, within the context of so many different and competing worldviews? And secondly, how can Christianity provide social cohesion to a society when there are so many competing points of view within it? Again, this is the challenge of modern life. In the past, we tended to live within communities that reinforced and did not significantly challenge our view of the world and our religious points of view. But that's just not true anymore. And so we have to ask this question: where does Christianity fit in all of this diversity, in all of this plurality? How do we respond? What is our place in society? And how do we live an ethical life in light of this plurality, in light of the pluralist dilemmas that are so often assumed in our world today? So, what are our options? What can Christianity do in response to this pluralistic society? Well, the first thing it can do is it can take the tactic of what we call privatization. That is to say, Christianity can basically say that faith, religion, is private. And so, if it's private, we can continue to practice our faith in private. But we don't necessarily seek to bring our faith into the public arena to influence public laws, to impose a moral vision upon non-Christians who don't subscribe to our Christian faith. And so we can privatize, and this is usually done in two forms. One form is largely adopted by Christians, and a second form is largely adopted by what we call secularists. And we'll see how that works in just a second. But let's look at the Christian form first. First form is kind of like we separate from the world. Our faith is private in the sense that we maintain it in a community of the faithful. And the way to do this is to separate from society. The way to do this is to step away from and out of secular society and to create a specifically Christian counterculture. And in this has been popular in the history of Christianity. This is a monastic kind of style where the monk communities would pull away from and leave society and create their own societies, their own communities, their own communes. And in doing so, the idea was this was how they could be truly faithful. This was how they could be truly intimate with God and not polluted and distracted by the world. Other forms of this that have taken place besides monasticism are forms like fundamentalism. And this fundamentalism was this separatist move to say that we should, for example, not that the homeschooling movement is merely fundamentalist, but part of the reason fundamentalists sought to homeschool their kids was, again, to keep them from the polluting influences of other secular kids and other secular curriculums and that sort of thing, a very separatistic attitude and mindset. And of course, we even have in the United States, from the history of the Anabaptist movement, communities like the Amish who really try very hard to stay separate from the culture at large and to create their own countercultural movements. So this, again, is one way that we can respond to pluralism in society. We can try to create our own little community and separate from the world. Second view, which is very popular today and increasingly so, is what we might call the secularist, non-interference of religion in public policy. Now there is more than one way to talk about this in terms of secularism, and I want to be fair that there is a soft secularism that we observe in places like Singapore, where religion does not itself have a kind of pride of place in society, like it might in, for example, certain Islamic countries, where Islam basically has pride of place in terms of its politics and social mores. But in a place like Singapore, you have what's called soft secularism, and that is we're not going to give any one religion pride of place, but that doesn't mean we don't listen to religion. It doesn't mean that religion cannot have influence and input into public policy making, so long as there can be a way of persuading other religions and other secular people to be amenable to certain moral visions and legal encodings of those moral visions. So it's not a soft secular vision that we're talking about here. This is more of a hard secular vision, and that is that basically religion has no place in public policy. Religion can be kept private and should be kept private, but don't let it come out of its little enclaves and try to start telling governments and societies how they should live and what moral principles to use for their laws and for their social interactions. So this is a very kind of restrictive position, basically saying, hey, it's okay for you guys to stay in your little private box, but do not come out of that box and try to convince policymakers, including policymakers who are Christians, to make their Christian faith have an impact and a significant influence on public policy. Now, I think that we can recognize that this is something we need to evaluate. Part of the problem here is that Christian is by its very nature public. Christianity claims to, and in its worldview, be comprehensive and holistic. You don't separate public life from private life in any meaningful way in a Christian worldview, at least not, I think, from a truly biblically holistic and informed worldview. So the problem is here, you can't really totally separate from the culture anyway, but even so, you shouldn't try to separate or cordon off your perspective from public life. If you look in Acts chapter 4, for example, after Peter and John are arrested for healing a guy in the temple and claiming in the name of Christ that this man be healed, they were taken before the council of religious leaders and told, hey, you need to stop speaking about Jesus. And Peter and John turned to him and said, whether it's right to obey you or to obey God, you be the judge, but we cannot stop speaking of what we have seen and heard. In other words, I don't think you understand. We don't care if you think we shouldn't talk about Christianity or Jesus. We have to. The nature of Christ is he is Lord of all, and so we must speak into the society in a public way. And in that regard, telling us that we need to privatize our faith is not acceptable. We aren't going to do that. We are going to speak in public about it. Now, there's a second way to look at this. And this can be called a theocratic, or sometimes called the Constantinian approach, because Constantine succeeded in making Christianity a favored religion in the Roman Empire in the early part of the 4th century. So the theocratic or Constantinian approach basically also takes two forms. One is what we call hard theocracy. And this is the idea that, hey, we just need to reinstitute the Old Testament system of laws to make society under God. And that is our goal as Christians, is to essentially create a theocratic society like Israel was, and that in this way people will honor God and live, so to speak, in the kingdom of God on earth. This has actually gained a fairly sizable number of adherents in recent times. It's been called dominion theology, theonomy, from the combination of the words God and law, and it is it's a tempting approach to think, well, hey, we just institute the Old Testament laws and we are designed by God, made in his image, and therefore instituting these laws creates the ideal society, and everybody should be appreciative of that and realize that this is what we were made for. So that's the argument and how it goes. Now, I've got to say, we'll evaluate that in a minute, so let's not get too caught up in the problems with it. Let's look at the second possible one. That's more of a soft theocracy view, and this is the idea that, hey, we recognize that we're not going to try to kind of implement Old Testament laws in kind of a drop-down system without any revision, but we recognize that the principles and moral demands of the Old Testament as well as the New are really created for an ideal society. So our goal is to encode those moral ideals and to make sure that not just Christians, but all members of society live in a way that is pleasing to God and live among and under laws that are just and divinely sanctioned. So this is a kind of softer view. It's not quite so strict about what laws and prescriptions should be brought in from, for example, the Old Testament, but it does recognize the value of those laws and the importance of finding ways to encode them into the legal and social system. Now, let's evaluate this for a minute. Part of the problem is that you tend to, when you begin to take these views, you tend to make politics the means. Again, how are you going to enforce these laws? How are you going to determine them and then put them into law? You're going to do that through a system of legal and political pressure. And ultimately what that does is it makes it almost like politics becomes the means of bringing about the kingdom of God. That it's a political movement. A lot like the disciples. When Jesus came to the earth, they were expecting Jesus to be a literal political king and leader. And that's why even after his resurrection, right before his ascension, the disciples come up to him on the Mount of Olives and say, is it now, Jesus, that you're going to institute your earthly kingdom? Is now the time you're going to do the political thing? And of course he says, I'm coming again, and at that point will be the great society. But in the meantime, no, my purpose is not to put a political and legal system into place at this time. So ultimately, putting politics into play here tends to absolutize it and justify the means to what we think is a moral society. But this is another part of an evaluation. It is not at all clear how you drop down Old Testament Israel and its theocratic relationship to God into a society that doesn't have the same kind of covenantal relationship. Christians have that covenantal relationship with God, but non-Christians, not so much. And so how is it that the theocratic laws of Israel under the covenantal relationship with God can be translated into a universal system of moral expectations for all people in all places? This is problematic, and again, I cannot give an adequate critique of this. There are some good critiques out there of dominion theology and the many problems involved, and so we have to recognize that so much of what we expect in moral life comes through the power of the Spirit and is so much greater and farther deeper than just putting kind of legal regulations in place, as if that is going to create a just society, a good society from the inside out. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned about lawmaking. We shouldn't be concerned about moral principles in our law and in our society. Not at all. But what I'm saying is that ultimately Christianity's demands for moral life are so much greater than mere legal principles and mere political kind of power expectations. So we just have to be very careful when we begin to expect our society to become truly like Christian. And I think you observe this in history too, that a lot of times what happens in these situations is become oppressive, and people get into power and they abuse that power. And Christianity and the church, when it was in charge before the time of the Reformation, was deeply troubled, deeply corrupt, and its power had made the leaders of both the church and the kingdoms extremely ungodly. And so we have to be very careful about assuming that just having the right laws in place and putting Christian people in charge is going to somehow bring about that great society. Really, I think only Christ will do that at the end of the age. Now, let's take a look at a third option. And this is what we would call civil state religion. And this is kind of a pseudo-religious option where the state will create a kind of religious base by kind of trying to combine all of the the best of all the world religions into a moral system that everybody can say, yes, we like this, the majority of people can benefit. The problem with this is, how do you determine that? Who decides? And the civil state religion really almost becomes its own religion. It kind of becomes this additional religious perspective, and it really makes the state into what we would call like an idol, instead of a intimate and clear understanding of our connection to God. Civil state religion tends to take the place of all religions and tries to absolutize itself in the process. So let's take a look at a fourth one, which I think is probably the most promising, and I make no apologies about that. I really think this is the best way to go as far as we think about what do we do as Christians, how do we have an influence and an impact. And first of all, I think Christianity has a little legitimate, but not necessarily privileged, public voice within the pluralistic milieu. In other words, I don't think that it's always the best kind of place for Christianity to be the power brokers in society. I think that in some ways Christianity lends itself to being a religion of weakness and a religion of sacrifice and service and humility. And that so much of our impact and influence is not political. It is not enforced morality as much as it is exemplary, as much as it is persuading people to embrace the gospel and seeing the transformation of their lives from the inside out, being one kind of person and then coming to be a different. Now again, it doesn't mean that there aren't certain Christian values and ideals and moral perspectives that we don't want, there are these things we want the society to be able to embrace because they're good for everyone. But we have got to figure out what are those limits for public policy. In other words, what is it that Christians are truly looking for in terms of what should be legal and illegal, for example. Now, I'll give an example of alcohol. It's kind of an easy example, but obviously Christians aren't supposed to be drunk. They're not supposed to get drunk with wine. But does that mean that we need to outlaw drunkenness entirely? Like, for example, every person who gets drunk in a bar should be arrested. I think what this represents is that, okay, yes, there is a legal limit to the use of alcohol, especially publicly. You shouldn't be drinking and driving. You shouldn't be publicly intoxicated to the extent that you are causing disruption and social harm to others and to property. But at the same time, Christians are expected by God not to be drunk, even in the privacy of their own home. So the level of expectation for Christians is higher than it would be for just a general public policy, you see. And another example might be in terms of Christians are expected to love their enemies, whereas generally speaking, a society doesn't expect its members to love their enemies. Simply to do no harm to others is a probably more realistic expectation, because loving your enemies is a supernatural thing. It's not natural at all, and it's very hard to do even with the Spirit of God living in us. So our expectations as Christians are higher in terms of the social demands that God puts on us that we should not necessarily expect of non-Christians. But we should expect a certain kind of base level of moral life and how we can live in harmony with one another. So really, a Christian's best chance for impact in society, we should be living excellent moral lives. We should be serving our community, and we should be praying for our community and sharing the gospel in the context of that community and taking the risks that maybe we will be opposed or persecuted for doing so. But that, I think, is the best way for us to impact and influence our society. So tactically considering ways to do this and publicly argue and persuade others of our perspectives is an important consideration for us as Christians. We need to ask the question, how can we as Christians be salt and be light and be tasty and provide a positive vision for what we want for human life and flourishing? These are things that, as we think about sharing our Christian vision of what it is to be human, that becomes more persuasive than all the negatives and only just giving a long list of prohibitions. So I think we have to think tactically about how do we speak. Paul's a master at this. You can really see this in Acts chapter 15 on Mars Hill, where he is very tactful in the ways that he uses the language and the poetry of the Athenians, but at the same time does not compromise the gospel one bit. So I think that's a great model for us as we think about being influential, being faithful in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, and among whom we appear as lights in the world, or that we shine like stars in the heavens. Well, let's take a look and conclude by asking these questions. What, for you, do you think has been the predominant attitude of your church towards pluralism, the pluralism of the contemporary age? And what do you think it should be? I want you to contemplate that as we consider Christianity in the context of a plural world.